"I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes, but your account balance is zero." The young realtor's voice sounded polite, almost rehearsed, as if she had delivered bad news many times before. I stared at the neat stack of papers on the desk in front of me, the purchase agreement for the small white cottage with blue shutters that I had dreamed about for 10 long years. The office smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and fresh coffee, sunlight spilling through the wide glass windows onto the polished hardwood floor. Everything looked so bright, so hopeful. Just minutes earlier, I had been imagining where I would place my rocking chair on the porch, how the ocean breeze would feel against my face on quiet mornings. I had pictured my late husband smiling at me from the doorway, proud that I had finally given myself something after a lifetime of giving to everyone else. "That can't be right," I said softly, my voice steady even as something deep inside my chest tightened. I slid my reading glasses higher on my nose and leaned closer to the screen she had turned toward me. The number was there in plain black digits. 0. I blinked once. Then again. Numbers had always made sense to me. They were honest. They did not lie or twist themselves into cruel surprises. For 10 years I had saved $10,000 every single month from a salary that barely reached $50,000 a year. I had worked early shifts at the accounting office and late shifts balancing books for a diner that smelled of frying bacon and burnt coffee. I had packed my own lunches. I had worn the same winter coat until the lining frayed at the cuffs. I had turned down vacations, dinners out, even small luxuries like getting my hair professionally done. Every sacrifice had been folded neatly into that account, labeled in my mind as freedom. "Would you like me to give you a moment?" the realtor asked gently. I nodded, though I did not move. My hands rested in my lap, calm still. Years ago, when my husband passed away, I had learned that panic solved nothing. Grief had taught me to sit very quietly while the world shifted beneath my feet. I reached into my purse and pulled out my bank statement from the previous month. The balance there was healthy, strong. It represented discipline, survival, hope. "There must be some mistake," I murmured. "I'll call my bank." The phone felt heavier than usual as I dialed. A cheerful automated voice welcomed me, as if nothing had changed. As if my future had not just vanished in the span of a single breath. When the representative confirmed the transactions, her tone remained professional, detached. The transfers had been authorized. The funds had been moved legally. The beneficiary's name appeared on the screen like a quiet explosion. Brittany Hayes. My daughter. I thanked the representative and ended the call before she could ask if there was anything else she could help me with. The answer was no. There was nothing anyone could help me with now. I folded the purchase agreement with precise care and placed it back on the desk. Outside, a family walked past the office window laughing, a little boy tugging on his mother's hand. Life continued in tidy, predictable motions. Inside, something vast and silent was rearranging itself. I thought of Brittany's recent visits, the way she had asked casual questions about my savings, about my plans for retirement. I had mistaken curiosity for concern, love for interest. I rose from the chair slowly, smoothing the front of my pale gray cardigan. "I'm afraid I'll need to postpone," I told the realtor, offering a small smile that felt like porcelain on my lips. She nodded with sympathetic eyes, already gathering the papers into a neat pile, already moving on. In the parking lot, the autumn air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant sea salt. I sat behind the wheel of my aging sedan and rested my hands on the steering wheel. For a long moment I did nothing. Then I started the engine. If Brittany believed she had taken everything from me, she did not understand the first thing about the woman who had spent 10 years building a life out of patience. Money could disappear overnight, but resolve did not. And neither did memory. As I drove away from the cottage that was supposed to be mine, I realized that this was not the end of a dream. It was the beginning of a reckoning. I did not go home after leaving the realtor's office. Instead, I drove aimlessly through streets I had known for decades, past grocery stores where I had counted coupons at the checkout, past bus stops where I had waited in the freezing wind after late shifts, past the small brick church where I had once prayed for strength when my husband's illness began to steal him away from me. The town looked the same as it always had, ordinary and predictable, yet something about it felt unfamiliar now, as if I were seeing it through a pane of glass that had suddenly thickened between me and the rest of the world. I finally pulled into the parking lot of a modest diner on Maple Avenue, The same diner where I had spent 6 years reconciling receipts under fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. Inside, the scent of brewed coffee and toasted bread wrapped around me like a memory. I chose a booth near the window and ordered black coffee, my voice calm, my hands steady. The waitress did not recognize me. Time moves quickly when you are not paying attention. As I waited, I found myself drifting back through the long corridor of the past decade, walking again through the quiet routines that had shaped my days. Every morning had begun at 5:30. I would rise before the sun, dress in clothes that favored durability over style, and review the small notebook where I tracked every expense. Rent, utilities, groceries, medication, savings. Always savings. I had built my life around that single column of numbers, the one that represented escape. There had been winters when my old sedan refused to start and I had taken the bus instead, clutching a thermos of lukewarm coffee as snow gathered on my shoulders. There had been summers when the air conditioning in my apartment sputtered and failed, and I had slept with damp towels draped over my arms just to rest. Still, I never touched the savings. Not once. People at the office would invite me to birthday lunches or weekend trips to the lake. I would smile and decline, offering polite excuses that concealed the truth. I was not being deprived. I was investing in a future that no one else could take from me. Or so I believed. When Brittany was younger, she had watched me juggle bills and part-time jobs with a kind of distant admiration. She would sit at the kitchen table doing her homework while I balanced checkbooks beside her, the lamplight pooling over our shared silence. I had told her often that discipline was freedom, that independence was the greatest gift a person could give themselves. Somewhere along the way, those lessons must have sounded like limitations instead of wisdom. The waitress returned with my coffee, placing the mug gently on the table. Steam curled upward in delicate spirals. I wrapped my fingers around the warmth and took a slow sip. Bitter. Familiar. Grounding. I began to replay recent months in my mind with new clarity. Brittany's sudden interest in my online banking. Her cheerful insistence that she could help me manage passwords and security updates. The afternoon she had convinced me to sign documents that she described as routine account protections. I had trusted her because she was my daughter. Trust, I realize now, is not always broken in loud, dramatic moments. Sometimes it is dissolved quietly, like sugar in hot coffee, until the sweetness becomes something you no longer question. Outside the diner window, cars moved through the intersection in orderly lines, guided by signals that blinked from red to green. Order, direction, purpose. I had built my life on those principles. Losing the money did not mean losing the habits that had sustained me. I set the empty mug down and reached for my purse. Inside, beneath my wallet and reading glasses, lay a small leather folder that Brittany did not know existed. I had opened it only twice in 10 years, each time to confirm that certain contingencies remained untouched. My reflection in the window looked older than it had that morning, but there was something else there too. Not despair. Not defeat. Something steadier. I paid the bill, left a modest tip, and stepped back into the crisp afternoon air. If the past decade had taught me anything, it was that patience could outlast almost any betrayal. And patience, I suspected, was about to become my greatest ally. I did not call Brittany that evening. I did not send a message or leave a voicemail filled with accusations. Instead, I drove back to my small apartment on Birch Street, parked beneath the flickering street lamp, and sat in the quiet for a long time before stepping out of the car. The building looked exactly as it always had. A modest structure with peeling paint, and a row of mailboxes that rattled whenever someone slammed the front door. For 10 years it had been my fortress of discipline, the place where I had learned to live on less so that one day I could finally live on my own terms. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand resting on the worn wooden railing polished smooth by countless strangers who had come and gone before me. My apartment greeted me with its familiar stillness. A single lamp illuminated the living room, casting soft shadows across the thrift store furniture I had carefully chosen for durability rather than charm. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and removed the leather folder I had glanced at earlier in the diner. For years it had remained untouched, a quiet insurance policy against uncertainty. Now it felt heavier, more significant, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. I placed it on the table but did not open it yet. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out at the dim glow of the city beyond. Somewhere, a siren wailed briefly before fading into the distance. Life continued, indifferent to the private storms unfolding behind closed doors. I thought about Brittany as a child, the way she used to run toward me after school, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her voice full of stories about spelling tests and playground triumphs. She had once believed I could fix anything. Somewhere between those bright afternoons and this quiet night, our roles had shifted without my noticing. She had become the one who knew about online investments, digital transfers, and financial shortcuts. I had allowed myself to believe that her confidence meant competence, that her eagerness meant loyalty. Perhaps I had been too proud of her success to question its foundation. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me, a steady mechanical heartbeat. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, finally opening the leather folder. Inside were documents that represented choices I had made long before Brittany showed interest in my accounts. A secondary trust, established quietly after my husband's passing. A modest parcel of land in another state, purchased with funds no one else knew existed. Letters from an attorney who had once advised me that true security often requires silence. I read each page carefully, reacquainting myself with the language of protection and contingency. The betrayal I faced now was painful, yes, but it was not entirely unexpected. Over the past year, there had been moments when Brittany's tone had shifted from affectionate to strategic, when her questions had lingered too long on numbers and timelines. Same practical clothing that had carried me through countless work days. There was comfort in routine. Branch where I had worked part-time years ago, the route so familiar that my hands guided the wheel without conscious effort. Along the way, I passed a park where parents pushed strollers along winding paths, their conversations drifting into the crisp morning air. I wondered how many of them imagined the future as a series of gentle progressions, rather than sudden revelations. When I parked, I remained in the car for a moment, observing the building's reflective windows. Inside those walls, records existed that could tell a story Brittany believed she had already rewritten. I gathered my purse, straightened my shoulders, and stepped onto the sidewalk. Each movement felt deliberate, purposeful. 10 years of sacrifice had not merely built a savings account. They had forged a discipline that would now shape every decision I made. As the automatic doors opened and the familiar scent of polished floors and fresh paper enveloped me, I understood that this was no longer about reclaiming money. It was about reclaiming control over the narrative of my own life. The bank lobby felt both familiar and distant as I stepped inside, the soft echo of my footsteps blending with the quiet murmur of morning customers. For years this place had represented stability to me, a sanctuary of predictable transactions and carefully balanced ledgers. Today it felt like a stage where a truth long concealed was about to be rehearsed in full daylight. I approached the reception desk and offered my name with a polite smile that revealed nothing of the storm I carried within. The young man behind the counter nodded and asked me to wait while he notified a senior associate. I took a seat near the window and watched sunlight slide slowly across the tiled floor, marking time with a patience I had come to understand well. In my purse, the leather folder rested like a quiet promise. When Ms. Carter finally appeared, her expression shifted from professional neutrality to genuine recognition. We had worked together briefly years ago, sharing long afternoons reconciling discrepancies that others preferred to ignore. She guided me into a private office where the air smelled faintly of paper and ink, and closed the door with deliberate care. I explained the situation in measured tones, presenting printed statements and authorization records that documented the transfers Brittany had executed. There was no anger in my voice, only precision. Carter listened without interruption, her brow furrowing slightly as she reviewed the timeline. Mile carried me further from the woman Brittany believed she had outmaneuvered and closer to the one she had unknowingly created. The law office on Elm Street occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building that had survived decades of quiet changes in the town below. I parked across the street and sat for a moment, watching the reflection of clouds drift across its tall windows. Inside those rooms, conversations had likely altered the course of many lives. Today one of them would be mine. I gathered the leather folder and stepped onto the sidewalk, feeling the steady rhythm of my own footsteps as reassurance. The staircase inside creaked softly beneath my weight, each step carrying me further from hesitation and closer to deliberate action. When I entered the reception area, the scent of polished wood and old books greeted me like a memory of permanence. A receptionist with silver-framed glasses asked how she could assist me, and I gave the name of the attorney who had once written letters that now felt prophetic. She asked me to wait. I chose a chair near a large window where sunlight pooled on the floor in patient silence. My thoughts did not wander. They aligned themselves in careful sequence, the way columns of numbers had once done under my supervision. After several minutes, Mr. Lawson emerged from a hallway lined with framed certificates. Time had added more gray to his hair but had not diminished the clarity of his gaze. He shook my hand warmly, then gestured toward his office. We sat across from one another at a desk that bore the quiet marks of long service. I placed the folder before him and began to speak, recounting the transfers, the access changes, the subtle shifts in my daughter's behavior that now formed a coherent pattern. He listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal. When I finished, the room remained still for a moment, as though acknowledging the gravity of what had been shared. Mr. Lawson finally opened the folder and reviewed the documents with practiced attention. He explained that the trust one had established years earlier contained provisions designed for precisely this circumstance. If financial exploitation by a designated beneficiary could be demonstrated, control of remaining assets could be transferred into protective administration. It would not recover what was already gone, he cautioned, but it would prevent further erosion and create leverage for legal recourse. His words did not alarm me. They clarified the path ahead. We discussed timelines, evidentiary thresholds, and the importance of maintaining outward normalcy until the necessary filings were prepared. Strategy, he reminded me, is most effective when it unfolds quietly. I agreed. There was no advantage in revealing resolve too soon. When our meeting concluded, he promised to initiate the preliminary documentation by the following morning. I thanked him and stepped back into the corridor, aware that a significant threshold had been crossed without a single raised voice. Outside, the afternoon sun had grown warmer, softening the sharp edges of the buildings along the street. I walked to my car with the unhurried pace of someone who understands that urgency is not always synonymous with progress. Brittany would expect me to call eventually, to seek explanation or reassurance. Instead, I would observe. Patterns would reveal themselves more fully if left undisturbed. As I drove through the town's familiar intersections, I noticed details I had long overlooked. A new bakery where an old hardware store once stood. Children racing bicycles along a quiet side street. Life adapting without fanfare. At a stoplight, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror again. The woman looking back seemed composed, even serene. Not because she had been spared betrayal, but because she had chosen how to respond to it. 10 years of sacrifice had cultivated more than savings. They had cultivated endurance. When I reached my apartment building, I carried the folder upstairs and set it on the kitchen table beside my unopened suitcase. Evening shadows stretched across the floor like long questions awaiting answers. Tomorrow would bring new developments, new calculations. For now, there was only the steady knowledge that the narrative was shifting in ways Brittany could not yet perceive. And in that quiet realization, I found an unexpected sense of strength. That night I finally called Brittany, not because I needed answers but because silence can be more revealing once it is broken at the right moment. She picked up on the second ring, her voice bright with a confidence that felt rehearsed. She asked how my day had been, whether I had signed the contract for the cottage I had mentioned weeks earlier. I could almost hear her smile through the phone, the subtle expectation that I would share disappointment. She already understood too well. I told her calmly that there had been a complication with my account. A pause followed. Brief. Measured. Then she laughed softly and said that banks made mistakes all the time, that I should not worry about numbers I did not fully understand. I let the comment settle between us like dust in sunlight. Instead of challenging her, I asked about her own plans, about the new house she and her husband had recently mentioned during a hurried visit. Her tone shifted immediately, filling with excitement. She described vaulted ceilings, granite countertops, and a backyard large enough for summer gatherings. She spoke of opportunity, of stepping into a better life. I listened carefully, noting the pride woven into each detail. It was not greed she heard in her own voice. It was justification. After we ended the call, I sat at the kitchen table long after the clock struck 10, replaying every word with the precision of an accountant reviewing an unfamiliar ledger. Patterns were emerging more clearly now. Brittany did not believe she had stolen anything. In her mind, she had simply accelerated an inheritance she assumed was inevitable. The following morning, I visited the grocery store as I always did on Wednesdays, pushing a cart through aisles arranged with comforting predictability. Routine has a way of masking transformation. Neighbors greeted me with polite nods, unaware that the structure of my family had quietly fractured. I selected modest items as usual, comparing prices, calculating totals in my head out of habit. Discipline does not dissolve overnight. At the checkout counter, I noticed a young mother struggling to calm a restless child, her patience thinning with each passing minute. I offered a gentle smile and allowed them to go ahead of me. Small acts of kindness felt more deliberate now, as though I were reaffirming the values Brittany had once shared before ambition reshaped them. Back in the parking lot, my phone vibrated with a message from Mr. Lawson. The preliminary filings were ready for review. Progress rarely announces itself with fanfare. It arrives quietly, in envelopes and digital confirmations, in signatures placed on carefully worded pages. I drove to his office again, aware that each visit drew the net of consequence a little tighter around decisions Brittany had made without fully considering their reach. We reviewed the documents together, discussing how the trust would transition into protective administration. There would be notifications sent, timelines observed, responses anticipated, strategy unfolding step by step. When I left, the sky had turned a clear, unwavering blue. I felt no triumph, only a steady recognition that accountability was not an act of revenge. It was an act of balance. That evening, Brittany called me unexpectedly. Her voice carried a hint of irritation this time, as if uncertainty had begun to disrupt the certainty she preferred. She asked whether I had spoken to the bank again, whether I intended to pursue the matter. I told her simply that I was taking care of my affairs. Nothing more. The silence that followed was longer than any we had shared before. In that quiet space, I sensed the first tremor of doubt reaching her. I ended the call gently and set the phone aside. Outside, streetlights flickered on one by one, illuminating a neighborhood that continued its ordinary rhythms. Inside, the narrative was shifting beyond what Brittany could yet comprehend. Patience, I reminded myself, is not passive. It is preparation given time to mature. And as I prepared for the next step, I understood that the reckoning ahead would not be loud. It would be undeniable. The notification arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon, while I was folding laundry at the small wooden table by the window. It was an official letter, its envelope heavier than ordinary correspondence, bearing the return address of Mr. Lawson's firm. I set the neatly folded towels aside and opened it with deliberate care, smoothing the pages as I read each line slowly. The trust had been formally placed under protective administration. Notices had been issued to all relevant parties, including Brittany. The language was precise and unemotional, yet its implications were profound. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down, feeling the familiar steadiness return to my breathing. Accountability had begun its quiet work. Later that evening, my phone rang with Brittany's name glowing against the screen. I answered after the third ring. Her voice was different now. Not bright. Not confident. There was a sharp edge of disbelief woven into every word as she asked what I had done. I told her only that I had secured my future. She spoke quickly, describing misunderstandings, temporary financial pressures, opportunities that required swift action. She said she had meant to explain everything once the new house was finalized, once her investments began to show returns. I listened without interruption, the way I had learned to listen when numbers did not add up. When she finally paused, I asked whether she had believed I would never notice. The silence that followed was heavy, stretching across the miles between us. She did not answer directly. Instead, she spoke of family loyalty, of sacrifices she had made raising her own children, of how complicated life had become. I realized then that she was not seeking forgiveness. She was seeking validation. I ended the call gently and placed the phone on the table beside the letter. Outside, dusk settled over the neighborhood, softening the outlines of houses and trees into silhouettes that felt both familiar and distant. Over the next few days, Small shifts began to ripple through our extended family. My sister called to ask whether everything was all right. A cousin left a hesitant voicemail mentioning rumors about financial disputes. Brittany's husband sent a brief message suggesting we should resolve matters privately. Each interaction revealed how quickly narratives form when truth remains partially hidden. I responded with courtesy and restraint, offering no details beyond what was necessary. Strategy requires clarity, not spectacle. On Saturday morning, I received an invitation from Brittany to join them for dinner. The message was polite, carefully worded, as though she were testing whether normalcy could still be restored. I agreed without hesitation. When I arrived at their new house that evening, its exterior lights cast warm pools of gold across the driveway. Inside, the rooms were spacious and tastefully decorated, filled with objects that spoke of recent prosperity. Brittany greeted me with a tight embrace, her movements slightly too deliberate. We sat at a long dining table set with polished silverware and linen napkins. Conversation drifted from weather to school schedules, from neighborhood developments to upcoming holidays. Beneath the surface, tension moved like an unseen current. Halfway through the meal, Brittany cleared her throat and mentioned the letter she had received. She spoke of confusion, of legal language she did not fully understand. I met her gaze calmly and explained that the trust had been structured to protect both of us from decisions made in haste. Her husband shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The children continued eating, unaware of the significance unfolding around them. I did not accuse. I did not defend. I simply described the next steps, the timelines, the opportunity for resolution through cooperation. The room grew quieter with each sentence. When dessert was served, Brittany's hands trembled slightly as she placed a slice of pie before me. I thanked her and took a measured bite. Outside the large windows, the night stretched vast and indifferent. Inside, the narrative had reached a point where pretense could no longer sustain itself. As I prepared to leave, Brittany walked me to the door. For a moment she looked as though she might say something honest. Instead, she wished me safe travels. I stepped into the cool air and felt the weight of the past decade settle into something unexpectedly light. Consequences had begun their patient unfolding. And for the first time since the cottage had slipped from my grasp, I sensed that the future was no longer defined by what had been taken, but by what I was quietly reclaiming. In the weeks that followed the dinner at Brittany's house, the quiet machinery of consequence continued its steady motion. Letters arrived. Calls were made. Documents were reviewed and signed with the calm precision that had once guided my savings routine. I did not rush the process. Urgency belongs to those who fear the outcome. I had already accepted what had been lost. What remained now was the careful shaping of what would come next. One morning, Mr. Lawson invited me to his office for a final consultation. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows as he explained that Brittany had agreed to a structured settlement. Certain assets tied to the funds she had transferred would be placed under legal lien until restitution could be arranged. It was not a dramatic victory. It was a correction. A restoration of balance that would unfold gradually, the way my own sacrifices had accumulated over time. I thanked him and stepped back into the familiar rhythm of the town, aware that my life was quietly turning in a new direction. At home, I packed the last of my belongings into the small suitcase that had waited patiently in the corner. The apartment on Birch Street had served its purpose. It had been a place of endurance, a training ground for discipline. Now it felt like a chapter that had reached its natural conclusion. I left the keys on the kitchen counter beside a note for the landlord and closed the door without hesitation. The road ahead stretched long and open beneath a clear spring sky. I drove for hours, guided by a map that had once represented only a distant possibility. The parcel of land I had purchased years earlier lay near a quiet coastal town where mornings smelled of salt and wild grass. When I arrived, the simplicity of the landscape felt like a deep exhale. No polished counters. No vaulted ceilings. Just space. Just horizon. I walked the boundary line slowly, feeling the firm ground beneath my feet, reminding myself that security is not measured only in numbers. It is measured in choices freely made. Days began to settle into a new pattern. I met local shop owners who spoke in unhurried tones. I watched fishermen mend their nets at dawn. I learned the rhythm of tides and weather, allowing time to soften the sharp edges of recent events. Brittany called occasionally, At first her voice carried tension, questions carefully disguised as casual updates. Over time the conversations grew quieter, more honest. She spoke of adjustments, of lessons learned through discomfort. I listened without judgment. Forgiveness, I realized, is not a sudden gesture. It is a gradual recognition that understanding serves both sides better than resentment. One afternoon, I received a photograph in the mail. It showed Brittany and her children standing in their backyard beneath a sky filled with autumn leaves. On the back, she had written a single sentence. "I am beginning to understand what you were trying to teach me." I placed the photograph on the small wooden desk by my window and looked out at the ocean's steady horizon. 10 years of sacrifice had not ended in the cottage I once imagined. They had led me here instead, to a place where loss and resilience existed side by side without conflict. As the sun dipped toward the water, casting long paths of gold across its surface, I felt an unexpected sense of completion. The narrative had not been about money or betrayal alone. It had been about the quiet power of patience, the strength found in restraint, and the certainty that a life shaped with intention can always be reshaped again. I sat on the porch of the modest cabin I had begun to build and watched evening settle gently over the shoreline. Somewhere in the distance a bell rang. From a passing boat. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, yet it marked a passage. Not an ending. A continuation. And for the first time in many months I allowed myself to simply breathe.